I think we should start. I think it's time. My name is Michael Roytman, and I am a failed mathematician turned data scientist that has spent 15 years working in cybersecurity, mostly at vendors, building models for those vendors. So I worked at Kenna Security, I worked at Cisco, and what I built there were models that would attempt to help with decision making in cybersecurity, whether that was on the vulnerability management side, the application security side, detection and response. Every screen you log into in cybersecurity has some concept of a decision support model. It could be high, medium, low. It could be red, yellow, green. It could be a number from 0 to 100, from 0 to 1,000, from 0 to whatever. All of those models is the currency I traffic in. And in 15 years of doing that, I've learned something, which is that vendors all treat data from customers as something to be scored by their models, but that's not quite accurate. Every enterprise really is special, at least that's what the data shows. And I want to use this talk to talk through why that's true, how you can measure how special an enterprise is, and by special I mean how unique your environment is, how a model needs to change to reflect your environment. But also I want to talk about how to build local models and what a local model can accomplish in an environment. And when I say local, I don't mean running on the edge network in the sense of like a local AI model. What I mean by local is a model that is trained specifically on your cybersecurity data rather than a model trained on everybody's cybersecurity data. I mean local in the sense of a weather forecast. We've got global weather forecasts that essentially show you how a storm system can move across the United States. And we've got local ones that are telling you how likely is it to rain in the next 20 minutes. That is the shift that I think that cybersecurity is ready for and I want to talk about. Some of the ideas contained here have data behind them. They've been tried out. They've been executed. Some are, let's try to work towards this as an industry, and I'd love all of your input as well. So let's get going. First, I want to talk about what we need to model, and that is the easiest question we're going to answer today. Cybersecurity software has generally been in the business of detecting problems. And when cybersecurity started as an industry maybe 30 years ago, that was super helpful. So in the vulnerability space, which I'm most comfortable with, you've got CVEs. And for CVEs, you write more and more detections, you try to scan for more and more of them. This made a lot of sense in 2001 and in 2002 when there were maybe 5, 10 CVEs published daily. But today, we've got tens of thousands published every year, and enterprises can't keep up with the vulnerabilities, nor are any of them all that risky. Some are, some aren't. It remains an exercise to the reader to figure that out. The same thing is happening in application security and in cloud configurations. If you look at the G2 reviews of Wiz, everybody loves the product, but the only negative that people mention is about 60% of reviews will say something like, there's just so many findings, I don't know which ones to prioritize, I can't tell which ones are actually important to my enterprise. Because when everything is important, nothing is. And so resolving that is a question of risk. It's a question of risk tolerance for an enterprise, which is the first sign that it is specific to an enterprise. And it's a question of modeling. Let's get going. Models, when I talk about them, are not catastrophe models, they're not maturity models, and they're simply not large language models. What I mean by models is models of risk in cybersecurity that try to measure either the severity or the probability of an event occurring. So when a vulnerability is found on a system, what that means is that there's the potential for an event to occur, and there's the probability associated with that. There's many ways to model that probability. When you've got a detection that occurs in the detection response setting, that means an event has occurred, and there's some probability that that event is malicious, and there's a probability associated with that. Again, usually an exercise left to the SOC or to the user to make a decision about, with the difference that vendors will tell you this is a high one, this is a low finding, this one has been correlated with this other one, so it's a toxic combination. How toxic, you figure it out. A brief history of cybersecurity models will lead you to seeing that CVSS is not a model. If you look at the 2005 publication of CVSS version 1, very explicitly they say this is not meant to be a prioritization decision tool. It is meant to measure relative severity of vulnerabilities, and yet somehow it is a model by any other name. Everybody uses it to make vulnerability decisions. In about 2011, we started to see outside-in rankings of cybersecurity companies. whether it's letter grades or scores, credit rating type scores. They used external data to look at certain features that would correlate with the probability of a breach for an organization. So this is starting to get into the serious business of the kinds of models that I want to talk about, which is you've got things describing an organization. Could be different servers that they've got running, different types of software that you can detect outside, could be configurations, could be countries they operate in, could be their industry, and then you've got outcomes, which is breach data, right? Which we started to compile in about 2005 to 2010 by looking at news reports at first, and then that got more sophisticated with insurance data. In 2021, EPSS, which I was happy to contribute to, and my co-founder and partner Jay Jacobs worked with to bring to market, started publishing probability scores for vulnerabilities based on exploitation telemetry donated by vendors. And this, to me, is one of the more sophisticated versions of what I call a model. There's an outcome measure, which is exploitation activity for a vulnerability, and there's features about vulnerabilities which describe that vulnerability, and in between that is a machine learning model that's trying to quantify the probability of that exploitation. But all of these, no matter how sophisticated or incorrectly used or correctly used, are ultimately global models. What I mean by global is that a CVE in your environment versus in Marriott's environment is treated exactly the same both by CVSS and by EPSS and by Qualys and by Tenable and by every single scoring system that scores those vulnerabilities. And why is that? Part of the reason is that machine learning was hard up until 2021, still is pretty hard, but easier nowadays. And part of the reason is that the data required to localize models, vendors don't have access to. Enterprises have access to, so I'll get to that in a second. Let's talk about a couple models and evaluate them very quickly, and in that process, we'll build a little bit of a foundation for how we think about models so that once we get to local models, we can compare them and contrast them to CVSS and EPSS specifically. So I'll talk about vulnerabilities because this is the easiest one to talk about, not because this is the most valuable one to talk about. I think when you think about a preventative security program, you've got application security, you've got misconfigurations, you've got everything that you need to triage and deal with, part of which is vulnerabilities. But the reason I want to talk about CVEs is because there's an outcome measure for them. IDS detections, malware related to those CVEs. There is a global way to measure vulnerabilities based on exploitation telemetry, and the easiest and cheapest and freest and probably most useful one is CISA-KEV, which will give you a list of about 1,300 CVEs with known exploitation activity on them. And of course, there's more sophisticated and more paid or less paid ways to measure exploitation activity, whether it's just known exploitation lists or more sophisticated ones. But that outcome measure allows us to build models to try to quantify the probability of exploitation. So when we think about CVSS, we can start to think about how it performs as a model for preventing exploitation events from occurring. If you look at CVSS 10, that's that tiny dot on the left, your right-hand side, my left-hand side. For 10 plus, the size of the dot is how many vulnerabilities you'd have to remediate all of those vulnerabilities. So just the 10s. In doing so, you would remediate 0.4% of the vulnerabilities that have known exploitations associated with them. So that's your risk reduction. It's about 0.5%. And your efficiency is about 10%. So 1 in 10 CVEs that you remediate that have a CVSS score of 10 end up having known exploitation activity associated with them. And this is just a way to think about measuring a vulnerability management strategy based on CVSS. I think nobody does just 10s. That's silly. People do 7 plus, high and critical, as maybe a cutoff or a threshold. So if you look at 7 plus, which is encompassing of 10, right? Scroll down on that list, you have to remediate about 63% of all the known CVEs out there. That's your first sign it's a bad strategy. But you would have very great risk reduction if you actually did all that, if it didn't take many years at most enterprises, of about 86%. In doing so, your efficiency drops about halfway to about 5% efficiency, which means 1 in 20 remediations that fall under the policy of CVSS 7 plus are actually remediating vulnerabilities that do end up having known exploitation activity associated with them. And while that sounds like doom and gloom, I only use this to illustrate how to measure a strategy, and we'll keep talking about other strategies. EPSS is a model published at first.org that is free and open to the public every day. Every CVE gets new scores uploaded, and there's an API for them. There's a special interest group within FIRST as well, but EPSS uses donated exploitation activity as an outcome measure and is a machine learning model trained on about 2,000 features about each CVE, things ranging from is the vendor Microsoft to how many Microsoft products are affected by this to are there known exploits for this vulnerability that would be indicative of exploitation activity, how many references in NVD are related to that vulnerability. And when you run that machine learning model, what you find is that EPSS consistently outperforms. This is comparing version 3 and version 4. Version 4 was just published in March. Machine learning models need updating because they degrade over time, hence the different versions. But you can compare version 4 to a CVSS-based strategy, and you can see that for a particular effort percentage, or a number of vulnerabilities out of all of the known CVEs out there that you remediate, let's say 10%, you'd have to remediate CVSS 9.8 and above, and if you just follow that line up, EPSS would do the same thing, but get you a lot more coverage, or a lot more known exploited vulnerabilities would be removed from your environment with a similar amount of effort. So this is a way to compare two strategies, right? I'm saying if I remediate 10% of my CVEs, I follow this policy, what's the effect on my risk reduction? If I follow this policy, what's the effect on my risk reduction or removal of vulnerabilities with known exploitation? In a way, I'm defining what the outcome here is, which of course all models have to do as well. Another way to think about EPSS is to think about not just effort comparisons, but to think about coverage comparisons. If I'm at an enterprise and I have a mandate to reduce risk by 75% or 76.8% in the example here below on those two bottom charts, then if I follow the CVSS high and critical strategy, I would do that by remediating half of the CVEs in my environment. I could also do the exact same amount of coverage or risk reduction with EPSS version 4 by remediating 7.4% of my known vulnerabilities. But if we remember, I am talking about why global models aren't good, not why they are good or which ones are good. If we think about the future, I want to think about the difference between these global models that look at particular findings, whether they are on the vulnerability side, the application security side, or the cloud side, and assign a score to them that is the same across customers, and talk about what it means to move into this future that I'm thinking might or might not exist, which is where each enterprise maintains their own model because machine learning is getting easier and the data that enterprises have about themselves is much richer than the data that any one vendor has about an enterprise. So I was talking about efficiency and coverage and effort, which are actually classical machine learning metrics. This is a description of how they're calculated, but when you think about efficiency, I think about if I pick a strategy, and that strategy could be I throw a dart at a board, or that strategy could be the most sophisticated machine learning model ever. If I remediate 10 vulnerabilities with that strategy, and then I evaluate my past actions, what percentage of those 10 vulnerabilities do I expect to have known exploitation activity associated with them? That's a way to measure the strategy's efficiency. So for example, if my efficiency is 50%, that means that half of the tickets that I cut end up remediating vulnerabilities that do have known exploitation later. And I can do this analysis looking backwards very easily. It is a lot harder to do it moving forwards, which is why you need predictive models. Coverage, on the other hand, trades off with efficiency. When you think about coverage, that is, of all of the known bad vulnerabilities across my entire environment, if I follow this policy, I remediate CVSS 10 and above, let's say is a policy, what percentage of the known bad would I remove out of my environment? So if I remediate one vulnerability and I have 100% efficiency and that vulnerability was exploited, then that's a very efficient strategy, but I did not remove a lot of the known bad out of my environment. The coverage is really low. And it's very easy to achieve 100% coverage for a vulnerability management team. You just remediate everything. Super easy to build that strategy, except it's super inefficient, which is why there's a natural trade-off between the two metrics. So now when we think about measuring models and building models, we need to think about the data that we use to build those models. So when we think about why vendors, and I am also responsible for this, build models that aren't local, is that we have, at the moment that a detection happens, we have data that is theoretical. It is describing the action or the finding itself. So a CVE is actually a really good example of this. So is a common weakness enumeration, for example, for application security. But what it says is, I found this weakness in this piece of software that is running on this machine. It is this class of weakness. For a CVE, it is this type of vulnerability that can be exploited in this way. It is the definition of the thing that I have found, right? And when we assign scores to CVEs, or when we assign high, medium, low rankings to findings, to even penetration test findings, what we're essentially saying is the definition of this thing is pretty bad. If I find one of these, it's not great. But that is missing all of the context about what's actually happening on that system. A very simple one could be, I'm running Carbon Black in block mode, and it blocks that CVE from happening. So the thing is bad, but there's a mitigating control in place. It could be that I don't have a Chromium library enabled that is the thing that is actually the method of exploitation for the vulnerability in Google Chrome version 39.0.1. And so the actual data about the local environment is much more important than the data about the definition, not that you can do this without both. An analogy I like to use in my head, which is not the best analogy maybe, but I think about looking at a map, a physical map, which nobody does anymore, and going to a place and following that road is generally a directionally good idea. That is how you get from Seattle to Vancouver. But if you get there and one of the roads is broken or something has shifted because your map is old and outdated, for example, designed in 1999 and rarely updated since, then the terrain itself is telling you that the risk model that you have built based on the map is incorrect. That is to say, you need more data than what's provided at the definitional level, and you need contextual data. Another analogy I use is diagnosing a patient without ever running tests on the patient, right? A lot of this software is running tests in your environment, but the diagnosis that is being assigned to the test that is completed, whether it's positive or negative, I found this vulnerability because you have a vulnerable package, or I ran an authenticated scan and you've got this software installed and running. The diagnosis is, this is really bad because I found it, or this is not so bad, but it's never actually looking at other things running on the system itself. So what we need is ground truth data, or data describing what's really happening on these systems. And I like vulnerabilities because they're nice and simple and easy, because you can buy ground truth data. You can buy telemetry about which vulnerabilities are being attacked by attackers, either from publicly available sources. Shadow Server is a great one that you can just go grab. DHS CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog is a great one, or from paid sources, which is the multitude of vendors that sell vulnerability intelligence data or vulnerability telemetry data about malware exploitations or network IDS exploitations. When we look at CVE exploitations, we at Empirical have found that there's about 17,000, a little less than 17,000 CVEs with known exploitation activity from 2016 to 2025. That to me is the outcome measure, or the terrain rather than the map, for building vulnerability models at the global level. And this is what we're going to use to build a model and then tell you why all of this data might perhaps be more important or just as important as the exploitation activity. So the exploitation activity is your outcome data. It's what you're trying to prevent from happening. Data about vulnerabilities themselves at the definitional level. Is the vendor Microsoft? Is the product O365? Is this an Apache product? Does this affect multiple vendors? Is there an exploit for this thing? Is definitional level data. This is all of the terrain level, non-definitional, instance-based data that an enterprise actually already has. And this is what I want to say might just be the next push in building models in cybersecurity. So for one, you've got your actual scan data. The outputs of scans that you've run against your systems are super valuable in describing the prevalence of vulnerabilities in your environment, the assets that they're on, the types of assets, which vulnerabilities coexist with one another rather than living abstractly. You've got configuration data, which can give you mitigating controls. It can also give you not mitigating controls, but better descriptions about the methods of exploitation of vulnerabilities. You've got endpoint and host data, which is a whole other flow of data that describes the attack telemetry on those endpoints. So this is the same exploitation activity I'm talking about, but exploitation activity happening for one enterprise in one industry in one part of the world is not the same as exploitation activity happening on your EDR or NDR. You've got threat intelligence feeds, whether they're global or local. exploit and attack data, something like an IDS installed in your environment that tells you whether signatures are being triggered or not, which increases the probability of something being exploited. Past incidents, which vendors are almost never aware of, right, but is a huge help in understanding your risk profile and probably is already informing it, whether you know it or not, based on what the CISO is thinking about. And then lastly, ticketing data. What has been remediated on a particular asset? What software has been upgraded on there? What versions are they on? Who's working on them? Who's the asset owner? What's the business criticality? All of that data exists, but is never used to train the risk tolerance model because we have a dashboard we log into and we look at the critical thing. So all of this data is what we can use to localize a model, and I'm only going to talk about number one because this idea is new and because we don't have time. So why aren't global models enough? This is where everything we've talked about so far will come into play in assessing one of those models. So if you remember, efficiency is the percentage of vulnerabilities assigned by the strategy that do end up having exploitation activity. Coverage is of all the known exploitation activity, how much do you remove from your environment? And if you look at CVSS, that's the red line, it's not very efficient, but of course you can pick a strategy that has high risk reduction, right? You can pick 75% with CVSS, and you can get there by doing a lot of work, which is, I think, the situation that most folks are in. If you use EPSS, you will have much higher efficiency at getting to that 75% number. And if you train a model that accounts for the exploitation telemetry that I showed you, those 16,000 vulnerabilities, then your efficiency goes up because you know it's being actively exploited. You have more of the terrain than just the definitional level assumptions built into your model. And this is a simple XGBoost model, the same one that EPSS is, the difference being that it is aware of exploitation telemetry, whereas EPSS is built on donated data, so it's not aware of it. The key here is that I am measuring this against all known vulnerabilities, about 280,000 CVEs. And so when I say 50% coverage, what I mean is of all of 280,000 CVEs, I want to remove 50% of the ones I know are exploited. How efficient is that strategy is looking across essentially an enterprise that doesn't exist. It's an enterprise that has one of every vulnerability, which no enterprise in the world does. In fact, scanners will only find about 30% of the CVEs that are out in the National Vulnerability Database. There's no need to look for a Bluetooth remote code execution vulnerability on a skateboard if you're scanning a healthcare network. That skateboard is not connected to the network, nor is it an asset that's inventory, but that is a vulnerability in the National Vulnerability Database, and you can exploit it, that skateboard. It's just that nobody cares. And so if we think about localized data, all of this changes. When we think about a scanner finding information about those vulnerabilities, the current workflow is, let's find all the noise, let's make some decisions, and I don't care what the scanner is. I'm not calling out these vendors because they're good or bad. I'm just saying they find findings. As a team, enterprises then have to decide what's high risk, what's not, define that themselves, whether it's the scanner score or a different model. And then ultimately, the actions you take are prioritization decisions implicitly. It's cutting tickets, right? You could cut 10,000 tickets and nobody's going to do them, but you've still made the prioritization decision for the business. My proposal is that instead, you start at the vulnerability level and build a model of the risk that vulnerability poses to your enterprise, given everything you know about your enterprise, some of which I've listed out here. And then the action is essentially setting a threshold for risk. It's saying, I will remediate vulnerabilities that my local data tells me have a 95% probability of exploitation or higher. That's the capacity that I've got. To get there, you need to measure your own enterprise. And I posit that a lot of folks are already doing this. So this is the theoretical enterprise where you have one of every vulnerability. This is what the precision recall or efficiency and coverage curve looks like for CVSS, for EPSS, and for a model that's aware of exploitation. And this is what that same model looks like for an enterprise with 10 million vulnerabilities. It performs a lot more realistically, and the terrain looks a lot differently when you actually get to looking at vulnerabilities on assets. Because if you have one vulnerability that appears in your environment 20,000 times, that vulnerability being exploited or not is a lot more meaningful than if you've got 10,000 vulnerabilities being actively exploited, none of which exist in your environment. And so that data vendors can't know about. That data only exists post-scan, post all of the software that you've already ran, and needs to be fed back into as feedback into the original model, but isn't being done today. Just a small example of what that would look like if it was fed back in, and this is a simulated 10 million vulnerabilities, right? Just pick your random number of how many CVEs of each you've got. What this ends up looking like is if you train a model to be aware of that prevalence of what vulnerabilities exist in what systems, then the efficiency stays almost 100% for a 50% coverage level, for a 60% coverage level. And what's also interesting is that it still drops off, right? The model is never perfect, even if you're using local telemetry. And I think this part is actually one of the more interesting ones. It's that as that precision recall or efficiency coverage curve starts to decrease, what that's really saying is there's some vulnerabilities you can't predict. The model isn't a good forecast for them, some subset of them. The good news is that in this example, it's about 25% of it, but 75% of it you can predict pretty well, given using all the data you already have at hand, not just the data that's accessible to vendors. So this is essentially a way of measuring the performance of a strategy, not based on what other strategies are like, not based on how that strategy performs across all enterprises or theoretical enterprises, which I think is the state of the art today. You look at EPSS or CVSS, and there's debates about what's the right strategy or what is the right threshold. And all of that is a great conversation to have about which global model is better. But if you're using a global model, it's much more important to measure it in relation to a particular enterprise, which can be done by generating these efficiency coverage curves using actual vulnerability data that only exists at your particular enterprise. So what's the net of all this? It's that most enterprises really are special. Their changes in prevalence and their changes in environments really do necessitate different thresholds or different risk tolerance strategies based on the software that is being run, based on the number of assets, based on the threat vectors, but also based on what the environment looks like. If you fix effort, which is the top row, and use CVSS 9+, which is a pretty critical strategy for most scanners, most enterprises, your coverage then is 40%. So if you fix every vulnerability that has a CVSS score of 9 or above, you will remove 40% of the known exploited vulnerabilities out of your environment, on average, if you assume you have one of every vulnerability. And your efficiency in doing so is 9.5%. So 1 in 10 actions is efficient at reducing risk, and the other 9 out of 10 are not. If you do the same thing with this local model, you get to 95% coverage with the same amount of work and 22% efficiency. Now, if effort is not what you want to keep fixed, because you don't have the capacity to remediate all CVSS 9+ vulnerabilities, then you could look at fixing coverage. So saying, let's look at a strategy of CVSS 7+, what coverage does that get us? What risk reduction does that get us? If it's 75%, the efficiency of CVSS at accomplishing that is 5%. With a local model, it's almost 100%. And you can see this as the circle that's targeting the vulnerabilities that are known exploited is getting closer and closer to actually the risks that are out there, because the model is aware of not just, is this thing exploited, is this thing theoretically risky, but is this mitigating your environment? How many of it do you have? Which assets does it exist on? This is really just a pitch for looping your own data back into your risk tolerance decisions rather than blindly trusting what a vendor will provide, even though vendors are doing as good of a job as they can, they're just not aware of the data that an enterprise is. And data science is getting easier, so we can all do this at home. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is what the time is for. I would love questions. I know that is dense material, walk through quickly, so I assume I'll walk back into the slides for anything. We can double click on whatever you like.
Quick question. It looked to me like we're assuming the same level of effort exists for patching any remediation when we're calculating that efficiency. Is that fair?
Sorry, say that again?
The same level of effort is being assumed for any vulnerability mitigation. So like some things are a whole lot harder to patch than others.
That is a very good point. So, you know, the local model that's simulated here is built using only vulnerability data, like prevalence of vulnerabilities baked into the system. Do you have this or not? How many of it do you have? I think the other types of data that I listed out here could be even more impactful, and one of those is a proxy for how difficult something is to remediate, which I think is past tickets. Like if I cut a ticket on an Apache vulnerability on this particular system, how long does that take to remediate compared to a Google Chrome auto update? That data also exists, but that data is highly variable organization to organization, right? Of what is your patch cadence for Microsoft vulnerabilities versus how often do your users restart their Google Chrome browsers? Can you really update this AIX system that's sitting here? Or if I cut a ticket, does nothing happen? That means the difficulty is really high. I think that's an excellent point that, you know, just like I am assuming one of every vulnerability in the initial measurement, I'm also assuming equal effort in all these measurements, and the curves might shift.
Will you restate the maps versus terrain information?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
The maps versus terrain?
Oh. This is an analogy that I make to myself that it's been pointed out to me it might be a bad analogy. When I think about definitional level data in cybersecurity, whether that's a detection, right? This is a type of detection that CrowdStrike can detect, or a vulnerability finding, CVE 2014-0160 is a type of vulnerability that you could discover on an asset. That definition is something that was created in the case of Heartbleed 2014-0160, it was created in 2014. It has not been updated with the real-time information of what the road of deploying Heartbleed across enterprises looks like today. So the context of what exists on that asset outside of just the definitions that we are finding is often the more important part of whether you need to remediate a vulnerability or not, how long it's going to take to remediate, what apps are running on that asset, what business processes it are part of. All of that is vitally important, but all of that is missing from data describing an organization at the vulnerability management level or at the AppSec level. Which is not to say that you can do this without the maps, right? You still need all of that definitional level information to decide what to do, but it's not enough. There's a question back there.
Can you talk about how the effort level and the difficulty level of pulling together all of those pieces of data that are at in the local model and keeping that current?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you are correct that I glanced over that part. I think that a lot of the reason that people haven't been doing this is twofold. One is that the data engineering is very hard. And I know many enterprises are trying to do a better job of building data lakes, or there's startups that address data lake software type stuff now. But also the data science piece used to be intractable, right? There was no chance of an enterprise building a local model themselves in-house. Both are getting easier, right? There are now whole startups devoted to bringing all your data into one place, cybersecurity data specifically, storing it, whether it's in S3 buckets or Databricks or Snowflake or their own proprietary data stores, and then you can operate on top of that to build some of this, do some of this analysis. But yes, you're right. It is not easy, and the moving of bits is probably the harder part of all of this. That said, I think the key part is that it's very possible inside of an organization in a way that it is not possible for me sitting in the vendor seat, because I don't know your organizational context. You know, you never do, as well as the combination of tools that you're deploying at an enterprise. Cool. If that's it for questions, First.org/EPSS is the free public model to take a look at for probability of exploitation in the next 30 days. There's a special interest group that meets like every 2 weeks at First, and anybody's welcome to join it. And other than that, thanks for your time.